Hello there. In this video, I want to talk about the risks of extension of stay in the context of when you buy a HDB resale flat. I wanted to make this video for HDB resale flat buyers out there because I realized I couldn't find much YouTube content on HDB extensions of stay. And also after finding out the pretty significant risks and costs that buyers have to shoulder if they do agree to let their seller extend their stay. So just word of caution up front, I'm just a dude on YouTube talking about Singapore property. I'm not a real estate agent or professional, I have nothing to sell to you, but neither do I have any professional advice for you, right? In this video, I'm just sharing my personal layman observations and my thoughts, which I hope, of course, would be valuable to you. So if you're looking to buy a HDB resale flat, you may have heard about this thing called extension of stay. And this is something that is typically requested for by the seller as a condition, as a necessary requirement for the seller to sell you the HDB flat that you want to buy. In fact, this was exactly how I came to learn about this thing called extension of stay. Right? I was also looking to buy a HDB resale flat. And this was the moment that I learned about this and realized what it involved. And here's my experience. At first, when I heard about this, I thought, extension of stay. Not so bad, right? It's just about waiting longer before you can move into the resale flat you bought. Wrong. It was only later on that I found out that it's not just about delaying your move-in date, It's not about waiting for time to pass. In addition to you delaying your plans, or you waiting for more time, there are actually multiple risks and costs that the buyer has to shoulder. And I couldn't find any video on YouTube talking about these things, right? So before we go into all these things about risks and costs, let's just first touch on what an extension of stay is and what it involves, because it's important that we are clear about what we are talking about. So all of this is taken from the HDB website. I didn't write it. Okay, you can pause the video here to read the words yourself. Essentially, an extension of stay is when the seller and the buyer agree that the seller can stay on in the flat after resale completion. Okay, repeat after me. After resale completion. Okay, it is something that is requested for by the seller, right? Because the seller has bought another property and because of that needs time to move out of the flat that you bought and you became you have become an owner of, right? This is fairly common in this current period because many sellers are HDB upgraders who need the money from selling the flat to you in order for them to buy something bigger or nicer or something along those lines, right? And maybe also, very likely, they do not want to risk having to incur ABSD, which is additional buyer stamp duty. So as you can see here, right in the slides, you can pause if you want, HDB only allows the temporary extension if there are certain conditions fulfilled, okay? One of which, and you see the red box here, one of which is that the seller must have committed to buy a completed property in Singapore at the time of resale application. Earlier, I emphasized the word after resale completion. And really, that's the important point. Extension of stay is not just you waiting for more time. It means that the seller stays on in your property. Let that sink in. The seller stays on in your property after the completion. So yes, it's your property because completion, as you probably already know, is when ownership of the HDB flat is transferred from the seller to you. And let's just take pause here and digest this significance, right? The way I look at it, it's like you buying a watch or car or bag from the seller from, say, Carousel. You want to transact. You want to buy the thing. You put your hard-earned cash into the seller's hands, and then telling the seller, hey, you know what, take my money, take these thousands of dollars, put it in your bank, it's fine. And by the way, you don't have to pass me the thing now. Continue using it for free for the three more months. Okay? Good for you. So, is this something that you would typically agree to if you're on Carousel and you're purchasing a watch or car or bag? And by the way, all of these cost way cheaper than a major big purchase like buying a property. I mean, you think about it. Does it sound right to you? Then you may be wondering, right, why think so much? Are you asking too many questions? I don't have a choice, isn't it? Isn't extension of stay something that comes together with the flat resale? And you know you can't separate the two. Well, I want to say far from it, okay? Let's just be clear. If you want to agree to it, then good for you, right? But it's far from being an absolute requirement. Because you check out the HDB extension of stay terms and conditions. Look at the two boxes here. I mean, you check it out yourself, right? It makes it very clear that the flat resale and the extension of stay are not one and the same thing. They are two separate and different things, right? You are talking about two transactions and two agreements. So one, you agree on the sale and purchase of the flat, right? The other agreement is whether you want to agree to seller staying in your flat after the seller has taken your money and you have become the owner of that flat. Something else you may have heard about extension of stay is that it is free of charge, or quote-unquote rent-free. And this seems to be a norm or common practice for sellers to be granted extensions of stay that are free of charge. Perhaps except for the seller, paying for utilities and whatnot. So just bear in mind, right, if you are the buyer, what is free of charge for the seller comes at a cost to you, the buyer, aka the property owner, after resale completion. But for now, just bear in mind what the HDB website says, that for an extension of stay, you can see here, both buyer and seller may agree on monetary compensation to be paid by the seller to the buyer. Okay? HDB itself mentions compensation to be agreed between the buyer and the seller. It does not mandate or require that extensions of stay be free of charge, and it doesn't prohibit parties from agreeing on compensation. This mention of monetary compensation is also featured in the HDB extension of stay terms and conditions. So importantly, take a look at what is in the big red box here. The extension of stay T&Cs say that the price of the resale flat cannot incorporate the monetary compensation for the extension of stay. Which means, by right, the price you pay for the resale flat is one thing, and the monetary compensation you receive for the seller staying on in your flat is another thing. Two separate things, two separate agreements, two separate transactions, at least based on the HDB resale extension of stay T&Cs, right? So what you see here is that you have to price it separately, right? You price the HDB resale flat and you price the compensation separately. Of course, I am all too aware of market forces, and that's the problem with leaving it to be agreed between buyer and seller, because agreements are all about bargaining power. In a seller's market, seller has more bargaining power. In a buyer's market, buyer has more bargaining power. So it just depends on the time of day, I suppose. So for instance, if you really want a particular HDB flat, then I'm sorry, of course you have to be more accommodative of the seller's requirement for a long, free of charge extension of stay in your property at your risk, at your cost. Right? But be that as it may, you should still be fully aware of what exactly you are shouldering as a buyer, so that you can actually make a fully informed decision and see how best you can protect yourself against the risks, the costs, the downsides, essentially the things that can go wrong. In the remainder of this video, I will highlight 11 risks, downsides, and costs that a buyer bears in agreeing to the seller's extension of stay. Important note, these are risks, downsides, and costs for the buyer from the buyer's perspective. I'm not talking about the seller. And for these 11 things, I've listed all these in no particular order, in no particular ranking of seriousness or significance. As you enjoy the video, I leave you to take notes and you can assess for yourself what is risky, what is not, what's important, and what's not. First up on our list, costs that a buyer incurs. So over here, you can see an extract from the HDB extension of stay terms and conditions. There is a small $20 non-refundable admin fee that the buyer, not the seller, has to pay to HDB, together with other general costs and expenses for entering into the extension of stay arrangement. So one example, if you engage a lawyer to provide you with legal advice or to help you draft the proper agreement for the extension of stay, then you pay the fees of your lawyer. Second in this list, the risk of you having to compensate the seller if you cancel or terminate the extension of stay. So imagine you agree to a free of charge extension of stay, and in return, you are actually assuming all these additional liabilities. Of course, this kind of compensation to the seller would depend on what you actually agreed and you signed on with the seller. Just be very careful when a seller or seller's agent provides you with their sample or template agreement. Make sure you check what it says about you compensating the seller. For instance, how much money and under what kinds of circumstances do you have to compensate the seller. And if ever you are unsure about this, make sure you get proper legal advice. Risk downside cost number 3. Your minimum occupation period, or MOP for short, commences at a later date, only after your extension of stay ends. Okay, so this means that if you have agreed to an extension of stay, you actually are agreeing to wait longer before you can do certain things, like resell the flat in the open market. And bear in mind, this is even though you have already paid the seller at completion and you are actually starting to pay off your mortgage from completion onwards. But for MOP, you wait longer lah. Number 4. You, as the property owner now, have to pay the service and conservancy charges, while the seller is staying in your property free of charge. Okay, and also bear in mind, you won't benefit from any rebates for these service and conservancy charges. So you incur these charges at a higher rate. Number 5. You also have to pay the property tax, while the seller is staying on free of charge in your property. And did anyone tell you that your property tax is higher because you are not living in your property? So you pay the higher non-owner occupier residential tax rates, not the lower owner occupier tax rates, while the seller is staying free of charge in your property. So just take a look at this table, which I've taken from the IRAS website, and bear in mind, from 2023 onwards or something, different rates apply. So please take it upon yourself, check the IRAS website for more information. Number 6, and we are not even halfway through. Okay, we are halfway through. under the HDB extensions of stay, T&Cs, you, as the property owner, are responsible for ensuring that the sellers move out after the extension of stay period. And if the sellers do not do so for whatever reason, that becomes your liability and your problem. So take a look at what is said in this slide here. Right over here, you can see the HDB T&C say that you are required to take action to evict the sellers from the flat if they do not move out after the extension of stay. And this will be at your own cost and expense, and not to mention your time and energy. So imagine you're unlucky, your seller doesn't want to move out. What are you going to do? You may have to engage lawyers to take legal action. You have to pay the legal costs. You have to go down to the flat to talk to the seller, ask them to move out, things like that. All this takes time, money, energy. And HDB pretty much makes clear that this is your responsibility as the property owner, which is what you are after the completion. And no one but you will have to shoulder all these costs and burdens. Number 7. Should there be any infringements or non-compliances with the applicable rules or the HDB terms, then HDB will revoke the approval that it previously gave for the extension of stay. And you, the buyer, will be required to move into the flat immediately. To me, this sounds pretty disruptive and troublesome for the buyer, especially if the buyer had spent good money to rent another place elsewhere while waiting for the extension of stay to end. Something to take into consideration if you are in this situation. Number 8. Buyer is responsible for 2 things here. First, ensuring sellers and authorized occupiers comply with the lease and the Housing and Development Act. Second, buyer is responsible for infringements committed by the seller and occupiers. So this seems to suggest that if there's any infringement or non-compliance by the sellers and occupiers, guess what? HDB will come after you and not the seller. Which makes sense because you own the property now, right? After completion, and you are therefore the landlord. But hey, ask yourself, are you being fairly compensated for all these liabilities? Risk, downside, and cost number 9. If you have a dispute with the seller, that is for you to settle. HDB will not get involved. HDB will not mediate. You also cannot hold HDB responsible if things go wrong with the extension of stay. By and large, it looks like HDB won't come to your rescue, and if there's a problem, you are on your own. Number 10 on our list would be money. So you take on all the risks and costs mentioned earlier, while your money is sitting in the account of the seller. Yes, please do not forget, during resale completion, you paid a lot of money, right, to the seller. And also, do not forget, from resale completion onwards, you have to start paying off your mortgage. All while you do not have any access to your property and you can't enjoy it. The 11th and final risk, downside, and cost in this video. Damage and destruction of any part of the property that you now own. You are the flat owner and the seller is staying in your flat. Ultimately, what would happen if the seller is not careful and damages or destroys any part of the property that you own? In the most extreme of examples, like this picture here, what if the seller accidentally starts a fire? I think these are things that you'll be worried about as a property owner, especially because you probably don't have meaningful control or oversight over the seller during the extension of stay. To conclude, an extension of stay isn't just about waiting longer before you can move into your property. There are many risks, downsides, and costs for you, the buyer. And if you really have no choice, you really want the property, and you have to agree to an extension of stay, I hope you can consider taking care of yourself with the information provided in this video, instead of blindly saying yes to whatever the seller wants. So I think, for instance, at the bare minimum, you would want to ensure you are fairly compensated by the seller for the risk and costs you are taking on. Also, now that you are going to be the new property owner after resale completion, you may want to consult a lawyer and ensure that you have a proper contract in place to protect your interests. This brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it to be valuable. If so, like they say, smash the like button. And really, I just sincerely wish you all the best in your property journey.